Hello and welcome. I'm glad you have found your way here tonight to this place of flickering firelight, rough-hewn wood, and whispered stories. We are about to take shelter from the dark and muddy roads of the past and spend a night in a medieval tavern. This story is designed simply for calm and for rest. There is no need to follow every word. Feel free to let your mind drift with the shadows and to fall asleep whenever you are ready. Find your most comfortable position. Close your eyes and listen to the sounds of a world where a warm fire was the only refuge from the dangers of the night. Our journey tonight takes us back to the Middle Ages, a time of faith, fear, and brutal simplicity. We will explore the grim reality of seeking shelter for the night, a world of questionable food, shared beds, and dangerous company. So rest now.
Ow. And listen.
Our story begins at dusk, in the late autumn of the year 1348. A fine, cold drizzle is falling, turning the already muddy streets of the bustling English town of Bristol into a thick, treacherous mire. This is a world lit only by the dying light of the sun and the occasional flicker of a lantern. For a traveler on the road, the coming of night is a time of great peril. The gates of the town will soon be closed, and to be caught outside them is to be left to the mercy of the wolves, both animal and human, that roam the darkness. We are following a young man we shall call Finn. He is a stonemason's apprentice, traveling alone, carrying a letter for his master. He is weary to his very bones, his simple woolen cloak soaked through, and his leather shoes caked in a heavy layer of mud. He has been walking since dawn, and his only thought is to find a place of warmth, a hot meal, and a safe place to sleep for the night. He navigates the crowded, narrow street, a chaotic river of humanity, dodges a lurching cart, its wheels sinking deep into the mud. He sidesteps a fat merchant shouting at a servant and skirts a pack of stray dogs fighting over a discarded bone. The air is thick with the smells of the medieval world, the comforting scent of wood smoke from the chimneys, the rich, earthy smell of livestock, the stink of the open sewer that runs down the center of the street, the pervasive, close smell of unwashed human bodies. Finally, he sees what he is looking for. Hanging over a heavy oak door is a crudely painted wooden sign depicting a snarling boar's head. This is the Blue Boar in a common tavern and lodging house. It is not a place of great comfort, but it promises a fire, food, and a roof over his head. With a sense of profound relief, he pushes open the heavy, creaking door and steps inside. The change from the cold, wet street is immediate and overwhelming. He is hit by a wall of heat from a massive, roaring fireplace that occupies one entire wall of the room. The air is thick with smoke that stings his eyes, as the chimney does not draw well. The room is a large, low-ceilinged common hall, the darkness held back by the flickering, uncertain light of the fire and a few tallow candles that sputter on the tables, their smoke adding to the haze. The floor is not wood but packed earth, covered in a thick layer of rushes that have been strewn to soak up the mud and the spills. They have not been changed in some time, and they give off a faint, sweet, and sickly smell of old beer and decay. The furniture is simple and brutal, long. Rough-hewn trestle tables and hard wooden benches, all dark and slick with the grime of years. But it is the occupants of the room that cause a knot of anxiety to tighten in Finn's stomach. The tavern is crowded with a motley and intimidating collection of patrons. At one table, a group of local farmers are loudly arguing over the price of grain. At another, two surly-looking mercenaries, their swords resting on the bench beside them, are drinking in a grim, watchful silence. In a dark corner, a man with a scarred face and quick darting eyes is playing a game of dice with a young, foolish-looking merchant, and it is clear to anyone with a discerning eye that the game is not an honest one. Finn, feeling very young and very alone, makes his way to the great wooden bar at the far end of the room. Behind it stands the innkeeper, a massive, bald man with a thick black beard and an expression of permanent, weary hostility. He is wiping out a wooden tankard with a dirty rag. Finn waits patiently until the innkeeper finally acknowledges him with a grunt. With a trembling voice, he asks for a mug of ale, a bowl of pottage, and a place to sleep for the night. The innkeeper looks him up and down, his eyes assessing the quality of Finn's cloak and the smallness of the coin pouch at his belt. Ale is a penny, the innkeeper grunts. Pottage is a penny. A spot on the floor by the fire is a penny. A space in the bed is 2. Finn, who has only a few coins to his name, knows he cannot afford the luxury of the bed. He pays his 2 pennies for the food and a place on the floor, his heart sinking at the thought of a night spent on the cold, hard, and likely flea-infested ground. The innkeeper takes his coins without a word of thanks and shoves a rough wooden bowl of stew and a tankard of dark, cloudy ale towards him. The initial welcoming warmth of the tavern is already beginning to feel like a dangerous illusion. Finn takes his meager meal and looks for a place to sit. The long trestled tables are crowded with loud, boisterous men, their shoulders hunched over their drinks. There is no empty seat. To be an uninvited stranger at a table of locals is a dangerous proposition. He knows that his best chance of a peaceful night is to make himself as small and as unnoticeable as possible. He finds a small, precarious spot on the end of a bench near the great, roaring fireplace. The heat is a welcome comfort, a blessed relief from the cold, damp cloak that clings to his back. But the spot is a hazardous one. It is in the main thoroughfare between the bar and the tables, and he is constantly being jostled by serving wenches, carrying trays of ale, and by drunken patrons stumbling their way to the door. He places his bowl and tankard on the rough, uneven surface of the table and looks at his meal. The pottage is a thick, brown, lumpy stew, its surface glistening with a thin layer of grease. It is made from whatever was cheap and available: barley, onions, a few sad-looking carrots, and some small, unidentifiable chunks of meat. It is the food of pure, unadorned survival. He takes his first spoonful. The taste is bland, earthy, and slightly sour, but it is hot and it is filling, and for that he is grateful. He eats slowly, his eyes constantly scanning the room, a habit learned from many nights spent in unfamiliar and dangerous places. The ale is weak and cloudy, a small beer that is more water than alcohol, but it serves to wash down the thick pottage. There is no fork, only a rough wooden spoon. From his vantage point, he has a clear view of the tavern's ecosystem, a chaotic and often dangerous human zoo. He watches the dice game in the corner with a wary eye. The young merchant, his face flushed with ale and excitement, is clearly losing. The scarred man he is playing with, a man with the cold, dead eyes of a professional gambler, seems to win every other throw. A small pile of the merchant's coins sits by the gambler's elbow. At one point, the merchant, in a moment of drunken bravery, accuses the man of cheating. A tense, sudden silence falls over the corner. The scarred man does not get angry, simply stops, places his hand on the hilt of the long dagger at his belt, and gives the merchant a cold, thin smile. The merchant, his courage instantly evaporating, quickly apologizes and pushes the rest of his coins across the table. The game resumes, but the brief, chilling flash of potential violence hangs in the air. Finn then turns his attention to the two mercenaries. They are not drinking the weak ale, but a more expensive, imported wine. They are quiet, speaking to each other in a low foreign tongue. Their equipment is well maintained, but heavily used. Their chainmail shirts are dented, and the leather on their sword hilts is worn smooth from years of use. They are not local brawlers. They are professional soldiers, men who kill for a living, and their quiet, watchful presence is more intimidating than all the drunken shouting in the room. He also notices a small rattle-like man who seems to have no business of his own. This man flits through the crowd like a shadow, his eyes never settling in one place for long. He is a cutpurse, a thief who thrives in the chaos and confusion of a crowded tavern. Finn instinctively puts a protective hand over the small, hidden pouch inside his tunic, where his master's letter and his few remaining coins are kept. The atmosphere of the common room is a thick, almost tangible thing. The smoke from the great, inefficient fireplace hangs in the air in a permanent, hazy cloud, mixing with the smoke from the sputtering tallow candles. It makes his eyes water and catches in the back of his throat. The floor, covered in its thick layer of old beer-soaked rushes, is a mess of discarded bones, spilled food, and mud. A couple of large, lean dogs, the innkeeper's hounds, wander through the room sniffing for scraps. The noise is a constant, deafening roar, is the sound of dozens of conversations, of arguments, of drunken, off-key singing, of the clatter of wooden plates and the heavy thud of ale tankards on the tables. To a modern person, accustomed to quiet, orderly establishments, the sheer, unrestrained chaos of a medieval tavern would be an overwhelming and terrifying experience. For Finn, it is simply the reality of a night on the road. His only goal is to eat his meal, remain invisible, and survive until the morning. As the night deepens, the atmosphere in the tavern's common room begins to change. The more respectable patrons, the local farmers and merchants, finish their ale, settle their accounts, and brave the dark. Muddy streets to return to their own homes. The crowd thins, but it does not become safer. Those who remain are the hardened core of the tavern's nightlife, the surly mercenaries, the desperate gamblers, and the truly dedicated drunks. The noise level, which had been a constant chaotic roar, now becomes more unpredictable. There are long periods of sullen silence, punctuated by sudden loud bursts of laughter or angry shouting. The air grows thicker with smoke from the sputtering tallow candles and the naughtying fire, which casts long dancing shadows that make the room seem even more menacing. Finn, having finished his meager meal, tries to make himself as small as possible on his bench by the fire. He nurses his single tankard of ale, making it last as long as he can. He knows that to be seen as having no money and no drink is to make himself a target. His entire posture is one of defensive anonymity. He keeps his eyes down, but his ears are on high alert, listening to the shifting moods of the room. The inevitable explosion of violence, when it comes, is not a grand heroic brawl. It is a sudden, clumsy, and brutal affair. It begins at the corner table where the dice game has been going on for hours. The young merchant, having now lost all of his money, makes a final, drunken accusation of cheating. This time, the scarred gambler does not just smile. With a speed that is shocking, the gambler flips the heavy wooden table over, sending dice, coins, and tankards crashing to the floor. He draws the long, wicked-looking dagger from his belt. The merchant, his face a mask of pure drunken terror, scrambles backward, tripping over a bench. The two mercenaries at the next table do not intervene, but watch with a look of professional, detached interest, their hands resting on their own sword hilts. The innkeeper, with a deep, weary sigh, grabs a heavy wooden club from behind the bar and begins to stomp towards the commotion, shouting curses. The brawl is over in seconds. It is a messy, undignified scuffle of flailing limbs and shouted threats that ends with the young merchant being unceremoniously thrown out into the muddy street. His money gone, his evening of entertainment a bitter lesson in the realities of tavern life. The gambler calmly collects his winnings from the dirty floor and with a final, contemptuous look around the room, melts into the shadows and out the door. The innkeeper rights the table, still muttering curses, and the low hum of conversation slowly returns. For Finn, the event is a stark and terrifying reminder of how quickly the mood in this place can turn. Finally, as the hour grows very late, the innkeeper begins to close up for the night. He kicks the last of the drunks out into the street and bars the heavy oak door. The common room is now a dark, cavernous space, lit only by the dying red glow of the embers in the great fireplace. It is time to sleep. Finn approaches the innkeeper and reminds him that he has paid for a spot on the floor. The innkeeper, without a word, gestures with his thumb towards the hearth. This is the designated sleeping area for the poorest of travelers. It is the warmest place in the room, but it is also the dirtiest and the most public. Finn takes his small travel bag as a pillow and his damp cloak as a blanket, and finds a space on the rush-covered floor. The rushes are lumpy, damp, and smell of stale ale, old food, and something vaguely animal. He can feel the hard, uneven earth through the thin layer of straw. He is not alone. A half-dozen other men travelers, beggars, and landless laborers are also staking out their own small territories on the floor, their snoring and muttering a constant, close-by chorus. He looks over at the so-called luxury accommodation, the great bed. It is not a bed in the modern sense, but a massive, low wooden platform, piled high with a single, enormous straw-stuffed mattress. A dozen other travelers, those who could afford the extra penny, are already crammed onto it, sleeping in a grate. Tangled heap of limbs and blankets, arranged head to toe to maximize the space. The thought of sleeping so close to so many strangers is almost as unappealing as the hard floor. And with the quiet and the darkness comes a new and more intimate enemy, the pests. The old straw of the rushes and the mattress is a paradise for fleas, lice, and bedbugs. As he lies in the dark, a constant maddening itching begins on his arms and legs. It is a misery that there is no escape from. This was a simple, accepted reality of medieval life. A torment that would deny a modern person any chance of a peaceful night's rest. Lying on the hard, cold floor, surrounded by the snores and muttered curses of the other travelers, Finn attempts to find the oblivion of sleep. But rest does not come easily in such a place. The dying embers of the fire provide a meager and flickering light, but they do little to combat the deep, damp chill that seems to rise from the very earth beneath him. He pulls his damp woolen cloak tighter, but it offers little comfort. The sounds of the night are a constant low-level assault. There is the chorus of deep guttural snores from the men on the floor in the great bed, a sound like a herd of sleeping beasts. There is the quiet, insistent rustle and squeak of rats and mice, scurrying through the rushes in the darkness, searching for discarded scraps of food. From the street outside, he can hear the occasional drunken shout or the baying of a stray dog. It is a world without true silence, without peace. And then there's the constant, maddening itching. The fleas that inhabit the old straw of the rushes are feasting upon the new arrivals. Finn scratches at his arms and legs, a desperate, futile battle against an invisible enemy. He sees the other men around him doing the same, their sleep a restless, twitching affair. This simple, pervasive discomfort was an inescapable part of life for a medieval traveler. But the greatest threat of the night is not the cold or the pests. It is the other men. A tavern was a place of transit, a river of strangers. A man's only security was his own vigilance. Finn sleeps with his small bag not as a pillow, but clutched tightly to his chest, his hand resting on the small coin pouch hidden within his tunic. He knows that a traveler who sleeps too soundly is a traveler who will wake up poor. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, he is roused from a shallow, uneasy doze by a subtle sound. It is the sound of a silent, careful movement. He opens his eyes just a crack. In the dim, red glow of the last embers, sees a shadowy figure moving with a practiced stealth among the sleeping bodies on the floor. It is the rat-like man he had noticed earlier, the cut-purse. Finn's heart freezes in his chest. He lies perfectly still, his breathing slow and even, feigning a deep sleep. He watches as the figure kneels beside a sleeping merchant, the man's large coin purse clearly visible at his belt. He sees the glint of a small, sharp knife as the cut-purse prepares to slice the leather strap. It is a moment of pure, silent, and terrifying tension. But before the thief can make his move, one of the innkeeper's great hounds, which had been sleeping by the hearth, raises its head, lets out a low, menacing growl, and gets to its feet. The cut-purse freezes, a statue in the darkness. After a long, tense moment, he slowly, silently rises and melts back into the deepest shadows of the room, his opportunity lost. The hound circles once and lies back down. The danger is past. Finn does not truly sleep for the rest of the night. He lies there, his senses on high alert, his hand never leaving his coin pouch. He has just witnessed the quiet, brutal reality that existed beneath the noisy chaos of the tavern. It was a world of predators and prey, and a traveler's only defense was to be constantly, ceaselessly on his guard. The morning comes not with a gentle dawn, but with the harsh, grating sound of the innkeeper unbarring the great oak door. A sliver of cold, gray light cuts through the smoky darkness of the common room, a signal that the night is over. The men begin to stir, their groans and coughs filling the air. They wake up as they fell asleep, dirty, unrested, and still tired. Finn gets to his feet, his body stiff and sore from the hard floor. He brushes the straw and the dirt from his cloak. There is no morning meal for those who slept on the floor. He makes his way to the door, stepping over the still sleeping bodies of the other men. He steps out into the cold, damp morning air of the medieval street. The town is already coming to life, the familiar sounds and smells of the previous day already beginning to fill the air. He takes a deep breath. He is tired, he is dirty, he has been eaten by fleas, and he has narrowly avoided being robbed. But he has survived his night in the tavern. For a traveler in the Middle Ages, that was the only victory that mattered. Finn wakes with a start, not to a bell, but to the harsh, grating sound of the innkeeper unbarring the heavy oak door. A A sliver of cold, gray morning light cuts through the smoky darkness of the common room, a signal that the night is over. He sits up, his body stiff and sore from the hard, cold floor. His cloak is damp, and he can feel the sharp, itching bites of fleas on his arms and legs. He did not truly sleep, but merely drifted in a shallow, uneasy state of semi-consciousness, his hand never leaving the coin pouch hidden in his tunic. The other travelers who spent the night on the floor are beginning to stir, a chorus of groans and coughs filling the air. They rise slowly, their bodies aching, and begin the process of gathering their meager belongings, their faces grim and unrested. There is no morning meal offered to them. Their business in the tavern is done. They are expected to leave, to make way for the new day's paying customers. Finn gets to his feet and brushes the straw and dirt from his cloak. He looks out the now open door. The fine drizzle from the night before has turned into a cold, driving rain. The muddy street is a river of filth. He knows that to travel in such weather would be a foolish and dangerous act. The roads will be impassable and the risk of sickness high. With a heavy heart, he realizes he is trapped. He will have to spend another day and another of his precious coins in the dubious sanctuary of the Blue Boar Inn. He approaches the innkeeper, who is already sweeping the worst of the night's refuse from the floor with a twig broom. Finn buys another tankard of ale and a piece of hard, stale bread for his breakfast. This small transaction earns him the right to occupy a space in the tavern for the day. He finds a relatively quiet corner away from the main thoroughfare and settles in to watch the life of the tavern unfold. He is now not just a transient guest, but a captive observer of this den of vices. The tavern begins to fill as the morning wears on. It is the social and business hub of the town, a place where all strata of medieval life, except for the high nobility, would mix. The first to arrive are the local farmers and craftsmen, their faces ruddy from the cold, stopping in for a morning draught of ale to warm their bones before starting their day's work. Their conversation is loud and boisterous, a mixture of gossip about their neighbors and complaints about the weather and the price of grain. Then come the more professional patrons. The two surly mercenaries from the night before take up their usual table, their swords placed on the bench beside them. A clear and unambiguous statement of their trade. They drink in a grim, watchful silence, their eyes scanning every new person who enters the room, their men for hire, their loyalty belonging only to the highest bidder. And their presence adds a constant low-level hum of potential violence to the room. The scarred gambler also returns, his eyes already searching for a new, unsuspecting victim. He does not drink heavily. He is a professional, and his mind must be clear. He sets up a game of dice in a dark corner. The quiet, inviting rattle of the bones on the wooden table, a siren song for the bored and the foolish. Finn also observes the women of the tavern. There's the innkeeper's wife, a tough, weary woman with strong arms, who is as quick with a curse as her husband is with a club. And there are the serving wenches, young women who must navigate the crowded, chaotic room with a practiced skill. They carry heavy wooden trays of ale, dodging drunken patrons and enduring the constant, crude jests and unwanted advances of the men. It is a hard and often dangerous life, and their faces are a mixture of forced cheerfulness and deep, weary resignation. As the day progresses, the tavern becomes a microcosm of the medieval world, a place of commerce, of community, and of constant simmering conflict. A merchant might be making a deal in one corner, his voice a low, conspiratorial murmur, while a drunken argument over a game of dice erupts in another. Traveling friar might be trying to preach to the uninterested patrons, his words drowned out by a lewd song from a group of farmers. It is a world of raw, unfiltered, and often brutal humanity, and Finn watches it all with the wide, wary eyes of an outsider. As Finn sits in his corner, nursing his ale, he begins to understand the complex and often treacherous social rules that govern this small, chaotic world. The tavern was a den of many vices, and a naive traveler could lose his money, his dignity, and even his life if he was not careful. The first and most pervasive vice was, of course, the drink itself. The ale served at the Blue Boar was a thick, dark, and cloudy brew, served in a rough wooden tankard that was scarred with the knife marks of 100 previous drinkers. It was a small beer, weak in alcohol, but a staple of the medieval diet, often safer to drink than the local water. It had a yeasty, slightly sour taste, but it was filling, and it offered a small, dulling comfort against the cold and the misery of the day. He watches as the men around him drink with a grim and determined thirst. For many of them, the tavern was their only escape from a life of back-breaking labor in the fields or the workshops. The ale was a cheap and effective way to numb the pain in their aching bodies and the despair in their minds. But as the day wore on, this desperate search for oblivion often turned the atmosphere sour, leading to loud, slurred arguments and the constant threat of violence. The second great vice was gambling. Finn watches the dice game in the corner with a morbid fascination. The scarred man, the professional gambler, is a master of his craft. His movements are subtle and sure. He uses dice carved from animal bone, and Finn suspects they are weighted, loaded to fall in the gambler's favor. He watches as another man, a young farmer with a foolishly optimistic face, is lured into the game. The farmer starts by winning a few small hands, his face lighting up with a greedy, triumphant smile. The gambler allows this, patiently reeling him in like a fish on a line. Then, as the stakes get higher, the farmer's luck begins to turn. The gambler's wins become more frequent, his small pile of coins growing into a small mound while the farmer's own pile dwindles. The game is a quiet, tense drama. The only sounds are the rattle of the dice in a leather cup and the soft clink of coins on the table. Finally, with a single, disastrous roll, the farmer loses everything. His face, which had been flushed with excitement, now turns pale with the shock and horror of his loss. He has just gambled away a month's worth of hard-earned wages. He stares at the table, his expression a mask of disbelief and despair. The scarred gambler simply scoops up the coins without a word, his face impassive, and begins to look for his next victim. This, Finn understands, is the true nature of the tavern. It is a place of predators and prey. Every man is looking for an advantage, a way to profit from another's weakness or foolishness. He clutches his own small coin pouch tighter, the lesson not lost on him. This constant undercurrent of greed and desperation meant that violence was never far from the surface. A drunken insult, a disputed bet, a jostle in the crowd on any of these small sparks could ignite a sudden and brutal fire. The men in this tavern were hard men, their lives filled with violence and hardship, and they were quick to anger. The innkeeper himself was the only force for order, and his methods were as brutal as the men he served. Kept a heavy, knotted wooden club, a cudgel, behind the bar. When an argument escalated, he would not waste time with words. He would simply wade into the commotion, the heavy club in his hand, and use it with a practiced efficiency to restore a semblance of peace. It was a crude and violent form of peacekeeping, but it was the only language that many of his patrons understood. Finn learns that to survive in this place, one must be quiet, watchful, and constantly aware of the shifting moods of the room. He learns to read the subtle signs of impending trouble, the way a man's voice gets louder, the way a hand rests on the hilt of a dagger, the sudden silence that can fall over a table. The tavern is not a place of rest. It is a place of constant low-level vigilance, a social battlefield where a single mistake can have painful consequences. As Finn continues his long, weary vigil in the corner of the common room, he becomes acutely aware of another, more insidious danger, the profound and inescapable filth of the place. The medieval world was not a clean one, and a public tavern, with its constant flow of travelers, animals, and spilled drink, was a concentrated microcosm of this grim reality. His attention is drawn to the kitchen, a dark, arched opening at the back of the hall from which the serving wenches emerge.
Oh.
He catches a glimpse inside and is met with a scene of organized chaos. The air is thick with smoke, not just from the cooking fires, but from the burning fat that drips and sizzles on the hearth. The single small window is opaque with a layer of grease and soot. The cook, a large, sweating woman with a stained apron, moves through the small space with a frantic energy. She chops vegetables on a wooden block that is dark and scarred from years of use, its cracks filled with old food. She throws scraps and bones onto the floor where they are immediately set upon by the innkeeper's hounds. There is no concept of sanitation as a modern person would understand it. The water for cooking and washing is drawn from a large, open barrel in the corner of the kitchen. Finn had seen a serving wench fill it earlier from the same muddy well in the courtyard that the horses drank from. This water, of questionable purity, was used for everything, from boiling the pottage to rinsing the wooden bowls. The food itself was a source of constant risk. Finn watches as the cook prepares the meat pies, a staple of the tavern's menu. The meat is a mystery, a collection of offcuts and scraps of questionable origin, minced together and hidden under a thick pastry crust. In an era without refrigeration, meat that was slightly spoiled was often disguised with a heavy dose of pepper and other strong spices. To eat a meat pie in a medieval tavern was to take a significant gamble with one's own digestive health. The bread was no safer. A single, large, round loaf would sit on the bar, and the innkeeper would simply hack off a chunk for each customer. It was a communal loaf, handled by dozens of unwashed hands over the course of a day. This casual approach to food handling meant that sickness was a constant and accepted part of life, a bout of what they called stomach flux. What we would call food poisoning was a common consequence of a night in a tavern. The floor of the common room, which at first had seemed rustic, now reveals its true, disgusting nature. The rushes, which were meant to provide a clean and fragrant covering, were a miniature swamp of filth. They were damp and rotting, filled with a compressed, layered history of the tavern's life. Spilled ale, discarded bones, bits of old food, animal droppings, and even human spit and phlegm. These rushes were rarely changed, perhaps only once or twice a year. Instead, a fresh layer of straw would simply be thrown on top of the old one, creating a damp, stratified, and insect-infested mat that was inches thick. This was the floor that Finn knew he would have to sleep on, and the thought fills him with a deep sense of revulsion. The animals, which had at first seemed a charmingly rustic detail, now seemed like another vector of disease. The innkeeper's hounds were not the only creatures. Chickens would often wander in from the courtyard, pecking at the floor for scraps. And as night fell, the rustling and squeaking of the rats in the thatch roof and in the rushes on the floor became more audacious. The vermin were as much a part of the tavern's population as the human customers. Finn learns that the initial feeling of warmth and refuge offered by the tavern was a dangerous illusion. The fire was warm, but the air was thick with smoke. The ale dulled the senses, but it was served in a dirty cup. The food filled the belly, but it could just as easily fill it with sickness. The tavern was not a sanctuary from the dangers of the road. It was simply a different kind of danger. A place where a traveler had to be constantly on guard. It's not just against thieves and brawlers, but against the invisible enemies of disease and filth. Beyond the immediate physical discomforts of the filth and the questionable food, Finn began to understand the tavern's true nature. It was not just a place for travelers to rest. It was the beating and often treacherous heart of the local community. It was a place of business, a source of news, and a stage for the full spectrum of human vice and virtue. The innkeeper, he realized, was not just a simple host. He was a shrewd and powerful businessman, the unofficial king of this small, chaotic kingdom. His primary concern was not the comfort of his guests, but the steady flow of coins into his heavy leather purse. He would water down the ale to increase his profits. And the meat in his pies was always the cheapest, most questionable cuts he could find. He was also a moneylender, offering small, high-interest loans to the desperate gamblers who had lost their last penny. And he was an information broker. He would listen to the conversations of the traveling merchants, gathering news of prices and trade routes, which he would then sell to the local guilds for a fee. His role was to extract as much profit as possible from the river of humanity that flowed through his doors. The tavern was also the town's primary source of news from the outside world. In an age without newspapers or any form of mass communication, a traveler was a precious commodity. One evening, a pilgrim on his way to a distant shrine stopped for the night. The entire common room fell silent as he recounted the news from the capital. The king's south, the latest political intrigues, the rumors of a new tax. For the locals, this was their only connection to the wider world. Local business, too, was conducted here. Finn watched as two farmers, their faces serious, finalized a deal for the sale of a prize sow over a shared tankard of ale. The agreement was sealed not with a written contract, but with a handshake and a shared drink in front of witnesses. The tavern was the unofficial center of commerce, a place where deals were made and reputations were forged or broken. But this also meant that the tavern was a place of considerable danger for an outsider like Finn. It was a place where stolen goods could be quietly sold, where mercenaries could be hired for dark deeds, and where all manner of illicit deals were struck in the shadowy corners. To see too much, to overhear the wrong conversation, could be a fatal mistake for a lone traveler. Finn learned to make himself invisible, to nurse his single drink for hours, his gaze fixed on the fire, his ears open but his face a mask of weary indifference. He learned that the tavern was a complex and dangerous ecosystem, with its own predators and prey, its own unwritten rules of survival. As the day wore on and the rain continued to fall outside, he felt the full weight of his confinement. The initial warmth of the fire had long since been replaced by the chilling understanding of the tavern's true nature. It was a microcosm of the medieval world itself, a place of community and commerce, but also a place of brutal opportunism, simmering violence, and profound, inescapable filth. The night was still to come, with its own unique set of horrors. As the last of the ale is drunk and the final dice game concludes in a sullen silence, a new phase of the evening begins. The innkeeper, with a great weary sigh, picks up his heavy wooden club and begins his nightly ritual of closing. Moves through the common room, his heavy boots thudding on the floor, and begins to chase out the last of the lingering drunks, his voice a low, menacing growl. The men stumble out into the dark, rainy street, and the innkeeper secures the great oak door with a heavy bar, the sound of it echoing through the now quiet hall. The tavern is now a sealed, self-contained world. The great fire in the hearth, which had been a roaring, cheerful blaze all day, is now banked for the night. The innkeeper covers the glowing logs with a thick layer of ash to ensure the embers will last until the morning. The room is plunged into a deep, almost total darkness, lit only by the faint, red, pulsing glow of the dying fire. For Finn and the other travelers who have paid for a night's lodging, the time for sleep has come. But sleep in a medieval tavern was not a private or a peaceful affair. It was a communal and often grim experience. Finn, having paid only for the cheapest accommodation, makes his way to his designated spot. The floor by the hearth, he is not alone.
Us.
A half-dozen other men, a poor pilgrim, a landless laborer, a traveling peddler also staking out their own small territories in the rushes. He takes his small, rough travel bag and places it on the floor to use as a pillow. He wraps his damp woolen cloak tightly around himself. It is his only blanket. He lies down, and the reality of his bed is immediate and unpleasant. The floor is hard, cold, and uneven. The rushes, which cover the packed earth, are a lumpy, damp, and foul-smelling mattress. They are filled with the accumulated filth of the day, spilled ale, discarded bones, and animal droppings. The smell is a rich, earthy miasma of decay. He looks over at the so-called luxury accommodation. It's a great communal bed, which some of the other travelers have paid for. It is not a bed in the modern sense, but a massive, low wooden platform, piled high with a single enormous straw-stuffed mattress and covered with a few coarse woolen blankets. A dozen other travelers, men and women who are complete strangers to each other, are already crammed onto it. They sleep in a great tangled heap of limbs and blankets, arranged head to toe to maximize the space and to share body heat. The concept of privacy did not exist. To pay for a space in the bed did not mean you had your own bed, but simply the right to occupy a few square feet of the communal mattress. The snoring from the great bed is a deep, resonant, and varied chorus that fills the entire hall. And with the quiet and the darkness comes a new and more intimate enemy: the pests. The old damp straw of the rushes and the great mattress is a paradise for fleas, lice, and bedbugs. As he lies in the dark, a constant maddening itching begins on his arms and legs. It is a misery that there is no escape from, a constant, low-level torment that makes any deep, restful sleep an impossibility. This was a simple, accepted reality of medieval life, a torment that would deny a modern person any chance of a peaceful night. Lying on the hard, cold floor, surrounded by the snores and muttered curses of the other travelers, Finn attempts to find the oblivion of sleep. But rest does not come easily in such a place. The dying embers of the fire provide a meager and flickering light. but they do little to combat the deep, damp chill that seems to rise from the very earth beneath him. He pulls his damp woolen cloak tighter, but it offers little comfort. The sounds of the night are a constant low-level assault. There is the chorus of deep guttural snores from the men on the floor in the great bed, a sound like a herd of sleeping beasts. There is the quiet, insistent rustle and squeak of rats and mice, scurrying through the rushes in the darkness, searching for discarded scraps of food. From the street outside, he can hear the occasional drunken shout or the baying of a stray dog. It is a world without true silence, without peace. And then there is the constant, maddening itching. The fleas that inhabit the old straw of the rushes and the mattress are feasting upon the new arrivals. Finn scratches at his arms and legs, a desperate, futile battle against an invisible enemy. He sees the other men around him doing the same, their sleep a restless, twitching affair. This simple, pervasive discomfort was an inescapable part of life for a medieval traveler. But the greatest threat of the night is not the cold or the pests. It is the other men. A tavern was a place of transit, a river of strangers. A man's only security was his own vigilance. Finn sleeps with his small bag not as a pillow, but clutched tightly to his chest, his hand resting on the small coin pouch hidden within his tunic. He knows that a traveler who sleeps too soundly is a traveler who will wake up poor. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, he is roused from a shallow, uneasy doze by a subtle sound. It is the sound of a silent, careful movement. He opens his eyes just a crack. In the dim red glow of the last embers, he sees a shadowy figure moving with a practiced stealth among the sleeping bodies on the floor. It is the rat-like man he had noticed earlier, the cut-purse. Finn's heart freezes in his chest. He lies perfectly still, his breathing slow and even, feigning a deep sleep. He watches as the figure kneels beside a sleeping merchant, the man's large coin purse clearly visible at his belt. He sees the glint of a small, sharp knife as the cut-purse prepares to slice the leather strap. It is a moment of pure, silent, and terrifying tension. But before the thief can make his move, one of the innkeeper's great hounds, which had been sleeping by the hearth, raises its head, lets out a low, menacing growl, and gets to its feet. The cut-purse freezes, a statue in the darkness. After a long, tense moment, he slowly, silently rises and melts back into the deepest shadows of the room, his opportunity lost. The hound circles once and lies back down. The danger is past. Finn does not truly sleep for the rest of the night. He lies there, his senses on high alert, his hand never leaving his coin pouch. He has just witnessed the quiet, brutal reality that existed beneath the noisy chaos of the tavern. It was a world of predators and prey, and a traveler's only defense was to be constantly, ceaselessly on his guard. The close call with the cut-purse leaves Finn in a state of heightened, paranoid awareness. The fragile possibility of sleep is now completely gone, replaced by a grim, silent vigil. He lies on the hard floor, his cloak pulled up to his chin. His eyes closed, but his ears straining, listening to the quiet, secret life of the tavern at night. He is not just a traveler seeking rest. He is a guard, protecting his own small island of possessions in a sea of potential thieves. He becomes acutely aware of the other bodies in the room. Every cough, every sigh, every rustle of a blanket from the great communal bed sounds like a potential threat. The darkness is no longer a comfort. but a veil that conceals the unknown intentions of the strangers he is forced to share this space with. This constant, low-level vigilance is a profound and exhausting form of psychological torment. The physical discomforts also intensify as the night wears on. The fire in the great hearth has now died down to a bed of dull red embers that cast a weak, pulsing glow but offer almost no heat. A deep, penetrating cold begins to creep into the common room. It seeps up from the damp earthen floor, and it flows in through the countless cracks in the wattle and daub walls. Finn can feel the cold in his bones, a deep aching chill that his thin, damp cloak is powerless against. The smell of the room also seems to concentrate in the cold, still air. It is the close human smell of dozens of unwashed bodies sleeping in a single, unventilated space. It is the smell of stale ale, of old sweat, of damp wool, a thick and unpleasant miasma that is impossible to ignore. A modern person, accustomed to fresh air and personal hygiene, would find this single aspect of the night to be an almost unbearable ordeal. Sometime in the deepest hour of the night, a new disturbance shatters the relative quiet. One of the men on the great bed, a large drunken farmer, is roused from his stupor by a nightmare. He sits bolt upright with a great terrified shout. The other sleepers on the bed groan and curse at the sudden interruption. But the farmer, now awake and still half drunk, does not go back to sleep. He begins to sing. It is a loud, slurred, and mournfully off-key drinking song. His great booming voice echoes through the dark, cavernous hall, a brutal and unwelcome intrusion into the night. The other men shout at him to be quiet, but he is lost in his own drunken world. For nearly an hour, the tavern is filled with the sound of his terrible singing. There is no one to enforce any rules. The innkeeper is long asleep in his own private chambers. The travelers are left to deal with the disturbance themselves. Eventually, one of the surly mercenaries, his patience finally broken, gets up, stomps over to the great bed, and silences the farmer with a single brutal blow. The singing is replaced by the sound of a low groan, and then, finally, by silence. Finn lies on the floor, his heart pounding from the sudden explosion of noise and violence. This is the reality of the communal sleeping arrangement. A man's rest was at the complete mercy of the moods, the nightmares, and the drunken whims of the strangers he was forced to share the night with. There was no peace, no guarantee of safety, no escape. He spends the rest of the night in a state of exhausted limbo, too tired to be fully awake, but too anxious to truly sleep. He dozes, but his sleep is a thin, fragile thing, punctuated by the sounds of the room and the constant maddening itch of the flea bites. He dreams of his own small, quiet bed at home, a luxury he had never truly appreciated until now. The hours that followed the drunken farmer's brief and violent silencing were, if anything, even more tense. The common room was now quiet, but it was the heavy, watchful quiet of a room full of strangers who did not trust each other. Every man who was not lost in a deep, drunken stupor was now on a low level of alert, keenly aware of the darkness and the potential dangers it concealed. Finn, like the others, lay in a state of exhausted limbo. He was too tired to be fully awake, but his mind, sharpened by the night's events, was too anxious to truly sleep. He listened to the sounds of the room, to the soft rustle of the rushes as someone shifted in their sleep, to the quiet, almost imperceptible squeak of a rat in the thatch roof above. He became acutely aware of the physical discomforts of his situation. The hard, uneven earth floor seemed to be actively trying to find every bone in his body. A cold, damp draft snaked its way across the floor from a crack under the main door, a constant, chilling reminder of the miserable weather outside. The itching from the flea bites was a relentless, maddening torment that seemed to grow worse in the quiet of the night. The great hearth, which had been the room's warm, beating heart, was now a bed of pale, gray ash, with only a few tiny red embers glowing in its depths like the eyes of a dying beast. Its warmth was gone, and the room was now filled with a deep, penetrating cold. Finn pulled his damp, woolen cloak tighter, but it offered little protection. He was cold. He was uncomfortable. He was being eaten by insects, and he was surrounded by strangers in the dark. It was a perfect recipe for a night of profound and utter misery. The morning came not with the gentle dawn, but with the harsh, grating sound of the innkeeper dragging the heavy iron bar away from the main door. With a groan of protest from its great wooden hinges, the door was swung open, and a rectangle of cold gray morning light cut through the smoky darkness of the common room. The light was a merciless interrogator, revealing the full squalor of the scene. The floor was a disaster. The rushes were a chaotic mess of mud, straw, discarded bones, and overturned tankards. The benches and tables were slick with spilled ale. The air, which had been thick with smoke, was now also heavy with the stale, sour smell of a long night of heavy drinking and unwashed bodies. It was a scene of pure, unadulterated medieval squalor. The men began to stir, their bodies stiff and sore, their heads thick with the after-effects of the weak but plentiful ale. They rose with a series of low groans and coughs, a grim and unlovely chorus to greet the new day. There was no morning meal for those who had slept on the floor. Their business in the tavern was done. They were expected to gather their meager belongings and leave to make way for the new day's paying customers. Finn sat up, his body a symphony of aches and pains. He had not slept for more than a few minutes at a time, and he felt more exhausted now than when he had first arrived. He quickly checked his coin pouch. It was still there, untouched. That, he knew, was the only victory he could claim from this night. He got to his feet, his joints protesting, and brushed the straw and the dirt from his cloak. He did not look at the other men, and they did not look at him. There was no camaraderie among the poorest of travelers, only a shared, unspoken understanding of their mutual misery. His only desire was to be out of this place, to be in the fresh, clean air, no matter how cold or wet it was. He made his way to the door, stepping over the still sleeping bodies of the men who had paid for the privilege of the great bed. He stepped out into the cold, damp morning of the medieval street. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy with a thick, wet mist. He took a deep breath. It was the smell of mud, of wood smoke, of life. It was the most wonderful smell in the world. He was tired, he was dirty, he had been eaten by fleas, and he had narrowly avoided being robbed. But he had survived his night in the tavern. For a traveler in the Middle Ages, that was the only victory that mattered. The final hours of the night are a unique form of torment. The common room, now devoid of all but the sleeping and the destitute, grows profoundly cold. The great fire in the hearth has died down to a bed of dull red embers that cast a weak, pulsing glow, but offer almost no heat. A deep, penetrating cold creeps into the hall, seeping up from the damp earthen floor and flowing in through the countless cracks in the wattle and daub walls. Finn can feel the chill in his bones, a deep, aching cold that his thin, damp cloak is powerless against. The smells of the room also seem to concentrate in the cold, still air. It is the close human smell of dozens of unwashed bodies sleeping in a single, unventilated space. It is the smell of stale ale, of old sweat, of damp wool, a thick and unpleasant miasma that is impossible to ignore. Modern person, accustomed to fresh air and personal hygiene, would find this single aspect of the night to be an almost unbearable ordeal. As the first faint hint of dawn approaches, a new and subtle activity begins in the room. The two mercenaries, who had been sleeping in a corner, begin to stir. They move with a quiet, professional efficiency that is in stark contrast to the clumsy, groaning awakenings of the other men. They do not speak. They simply gather their gear, check their weapons, and strap on their dented chainmail shirts. Finn watches them through half-closed eyes, his body perfectly still. There is something menacing in their silent preparations. They are getting ready for the road, for whatever violent business awaited them in the new day. They are a reminder that the dangers of this world did not end when the sun came up. One of the mercenaries, the larger of the two, walks silently over to the young merchant who had been cheated at dice the night before. The merchant is still asleep on the great bed, his mouth open, a look of drunken misery on his face. The mercenary stands over him for a long, silent moment, and Finn is sure he is about to rob the man of whatever he had left. Instead, the mercenary simply reaches down and, with a surprising gentleness, pulls the merchant's thin blanket up over his exposed shoulder. A small, almost tender gesture of pity for the foolish young man. He then turned and, with his companion, walked to the great oak door. They did not wait for the innkeeper. The mercenary lifted the heavy iron bar with a quiet grunt, opened the door just enough to slip through, and then closed it behind them, leaving the common room in darkness once more. This small, unexpected act of kindness was more confusing to Finn than all the night's violence and threats. It was a reminder that these hard, dangerous men were still men, governed by their own strange codes of honor and moments of unexpected compassion. The medieval world, he was learning, was not a simple place of good and evil, but a complex tapestry of light and shadow. Finally, the true morning arrived, announced not by a gentle dawn, but by the harsh, grating sound of the innkeeper unbarring the door for the day. A rectangle of cold gray morning light cut through the smoky darkness of the common room. It was time to leave. The men begin to stir, a collection of low groans and hacking coughs filling the air. They rise slowly from the floor and the great bed, their bodies stiff and sore, their heads thick with the after-effects of the weak but plentiful ale. They are a grim and unlovely sight in the cold morning light, their clothes rumpled and stained, their faces puffy from a night of unrestful sleep. There is no morning meal offered to those who slept on the floor. Their business in the tavern is done. They are expected to gather their meager belongings and leave, to make way for the new day's paying customers who will soon arrive, seeking their own morning draught of ale. Finn, his body a symphony of aches and pains, is one of the first to get to his feet. He had not slept for more than a few minutes at a time, and he feels more exhausted now than when he had first arrived. He quickly and discreetly checks his coin pouch. It is still there, untouched. That, he knows, was the only victory he could claim from this long and arduous night. He gathers his few possessions, his small travel bag and his still damp woolen cloak. He brushes the worst of the straw and the dirt from his clothes. He does not look at the other men who are also preparing to leave, and they do not look at him. There is no camaraderie among the poorest of travelers, only a shared, unspoken understanding of their mutual misery. His only desire is to be out of this place, to be in the fresh, clean air, no matter how cold or wet it was. As he makes his way to the door, he watches the innkeeper and his wife begin their morning's work. They are not cleaning in the modern sense of the word. They are simply restoring the common room to a state of plausible functionality. Serving wench throws a few more armfuls of fresh but still damp rushes onto the floor. It's not replacing the old filthy layer, but simply covering it up. A process that adds to the thick, compost-like mat. The innkeeper rights the overturned benches and wipes down the tables with a greasy rag that seems to move the grime around more than it removes it. The goal is not to be clean, but to appear clean enough for a new day of business. It is another of the tavern's many illusions. Finn finally reaches the great oak door and steps out into the cold, damp morning of the medieval street. The rain has stopped, but the air is heavy with a thick, wet mist. The street is already coming to life, the familiar sounds and smells of the previous day already beginning to fill the air. He takes a deep breath. It is the smell of mud, of wood smoke, of life, and it is the most wonderful smell in the world. He is tired, he is dirty, he has been eaten by fleas, and he has narrowly avoided being robbed, but he has survived his night in the tavern. For a traveler in the Middle Ages, that was the only victory that mattered. He pulls his cloak tighter around his shoulders, adjusts the bag on his back, and begins to walk, his hobnailed shoes sinking into the thick, dark mud of the street, ready to face another day on the long and unforgiving road. As Finn walks through the awakening town, the grim reality of the tavern begins to settle in his mind. It was not an anomaly. It was the norm. For a common traveler in the 14th century, the road was a place of constant, low-level threat, and the inns and taverns that lined it were often just a different kind of danger, a different kind of trial to be endured. The town of Bristol itself is a maze of narrow, winding streets. The upper stories of the timber-framed houses leaning in so closely that they almost touch, shutting out the weak morning light. The streets are not paved, but are a thick, churning mire of mud, animal dung, and household waste that is simply thrown from the windows. The smell is overpowering, a rich, earthy stew of human and animal life. He makes his way towards the town gate, a great stone archway that is now open for the day's traffic. He sees a cart laden with barrels of wine, its heavy wheels stuck deep in the mud. The carter shouting curses at his straining oxen, sees merchants setting up their stalls in the marketplace, their voices a rising chorus of commerce. He sees beggars, their faces thin and pale, huddling in doorways, their eyes following anyone who looks like they might have a spare coin. This was the world that a traveler like Finn had to navigate every single day. And at the end of such a day, the only refuge available was a place like the Blue Boar. The idea of a clean, private, and safe room for the night was a luxury reserved for the highest of the nobility or the wealthiest of merchants. For a simple apprentice, the choices were grim. He could, if he was desperate, simply sleep outside, in the shelter of a farmer's barn or a thicket of trees. But this was an incredibly dangerous option. The roads were plagued by bandits and outlaws, men who would not hesitate to slit a man's throat for the few coins in his purse. To sleep alone and unprotected in the wilderness was to offer oneself up as a willing victim. Alternatively, he could seek the charity of a monastery, Many monasteries did offer shelter to travelers in the name of Christian piety. But this was not a guaranteed refuge. They were often located far from the main roads. And they would prioritize pilgrims or travelers of a higher social standing. A simple, unknown apprentice might easily be turned away at the gates. And so, the tavern, for all its filth, its violence, its questionable food, and its sleepless nights, was often the only viable choice. It was a necessary evil, a place that offered a roof, a fire, and the relative safety of numbers, a small, smoky island of humanity in a dark and dangerous world. The discomforts, the dangers, the constant vigilance, these were simply the price that a traveler had to pay. Finn finally reaches the town gate and passes out into the countryside beyond. The air is cleaner here, smelling of damp earth and the promise of the coming spring. He is tired, he is hungry, and he is still covered in the faint, sour smell of the tavern. But he is alive, and his master's letter is still safe in his pouch. He knows that tonight, in another town, down another long and muddy road, another tavern, very much like the Blue Boar, will be waiting for him. And he will have to face the same ordeal all over again. This was the relentless, exhausting, and brutal reality of life on the road for a common person in the Middle Ages. As Finn walks away from the town, the grim reality of the tavern begins to settle in his mind. It was not an anomaly. It was the norm. For a common traveler in the 14th century, the road was a place of constant, low-level threat, and the inns and taverns that lined it were often just a different kind of danger, a different kind of trial to be endured. This was a world without a formal police force. A world where the king's justice was often a distant and abstract concept. In a crowded tavern, a man's only security was his own vigilance, the strength of his own arm, or the mercy of the strangers around him. The innkeeper's heavy club was the only law, and his justice was arbitrary and self-serving. Finn reflects on the night's events. He had witnessed cheating, the threat of violence, and a brazen attempt at theft. He had slept on a floor crawling with fleas, in a room filled with the snores and smells of a dozen strangers. He had woken up unrested, his body aching, and had to leave without even the comfort of a morning meal. And yet, he had survived. He had kept his money and his master's letter safe. In the brutal calculus of medieval travel, this was a successful night. It was a grim and sobering thought. The very concept of a comfortable, safe, and private night's rest was a luxury that was simply unimaginable to the vast majority of the population. He thinks, too, of the small, strange moment of kindness he had witnessed the hardened mercenary pulling a blanket over the foolish, drunken merchant. It was a reminder that this world, for all its brutality, was not a simple place. It was a world of complex human beings, capable of both casual violence and unexpected compassion. This was the great, unwritten lesson of the road. It was not just a journey through a physical landscape of mud and forests, but a journey through the complex and often treacherous landscape of the human heart. To survive, a traveler had to be more than just strong or lucky. He had to be a shrewd judge of character, to know who to trust and who to fear. As he walks, the sun finally begins to break through the morning mist, its weak, watery light a welcome sight. The road ahead is long and muddy. He does not know what dangers it holds or what the tavern at his next stop will be like. But he knows that he will be more careful. He will be more watchful. He has learned the hard lessons of a night at the Blue Boar. His journey and his struggle are far from over. They are a part of the great, endless, and often brutal tapestry of medieval life. He is just one more anonymous figure walking down a long and muddy road, hoping only to make it safely to the next town before the sun goes down and the dangers of the night return. And so, the long, difficult night of Finn, the traveler, comes to a close. His is a story of survival in a world that was often brutal, dirty, and dangerous. A story written not in the grand chronicles of kings, but in the grime on a tavern floor, the taste of a meager meal, and the quiet, constant vigilance of a man alone on the road. The tavern's fire has died, and its patrons have departed. Hey now, your journey for tonight can come to a peaceful close as well. There are no more dangers to watch for, no more hard floors to endure. There is only the quiet of this moment. Let the story fade, and allow your mind to drift into a deep and well-deserved rest. Sleep well.